Good morning and welcome back from Thanksgiving break. I'm recording this Monday morning, so like that. If you're watching this later, that might not make a lot of sense. It might not even be morning. But today we're going to be going over sort of a tour on some of the alphabet soup of the New Deal. A lot of these agencies that were approved and put together by FDR and the Congress between 1932 and 1945. 33 is when he actually took over being president. They're still around. They're still doing things. They're still active. We've talked about some of the other ones in more detail before. We've talked about some of these ones before, but these ones are all still around. So let's take a quick tour through this group of agencies. So first we have the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is one of the first big pushes of the New Deal. It was part of the Banking Act of 1933. Pretty sure this is part of the first 100 days, but definitely the first year. And what this does, and what it continues to do, is it has the federal government insure your money. It guarantees your money in a bank account. Now, originally it would insure up to $2,500 of anyone's money in the bank, and for anybody working class, anybody that was struggling, anybody that wasn't basically what would be considered a millionaire today, $2,500 was what you would probably have in the bank at most. And if you wanted, let's say you had $5,000, and you're like, well, dang, I want to insure all $5,000. Well, you'd have one account at one FDIC bank and one account at another FDIC bank, $2,500 in each. There you go. And basically, the whole idea behind this was trying to get money back into the banking system, right? People were panicked. People were scared because before this, if a bank failed, all your money in the bank just went away. All your savings, all your retirement, anything. Just gone. And so what this does is, even if a bank shuts down, even if a bank runs out of money, even if a bank fails, the bank will then turn over their records to the federal government, and the federal government will make sure you get your money. It might take a little bit of time, but you'll have it. And this is still around. Now, the biggest change to the FDIC today is that it does not guarantee $2,500 of your money per bank account. It insures up to $250,000. So for the vast majority of you during your working life, at least, your retirement, might end up bigger than this. But I'd say for probably a good chunk of your working life, having $250,000 in a savings account or a checking account would be pretty fantastic. And if you had more than that, you would have enough money to hire hire people to handle your money, and they would be able to keep it safe, through the various rules and regulations. But anybody that's, your average middle class worker, you're not going to have $250,000 in the bank. You probably have a little bit less than that. Now, the other big thing that they do is, instead of just like waiting for a bank to fail and then stepping in to help out, the FDIC actually investigates banks pretty actively. Like, they'll go out and check banks, they'll audit banks, they'll make sure banks are following the laws and following the rules and not screwing things up and failing. So they take a much more active role than they did in 1933, but they basically do the same thing. And you'll see, pay attention, pretty much any banking commercial you'll see or hear. And as, those of you that are getting closer and closer to your 18th birthday, you're going to be getting a lot more targeted advertising on your platforms of choice: YouTube, Spotify, Facebook, whatever. Nobody uses Facebook anymore. It's for aunts and uncles. Twitter, whatever, wherever you get your ads served to you that are personalized based on the information these people have about you. Once you start hitting your 18th birthday, you're going to be getting lots of ads for credit cards and banks and stuff like that. And anytime you see a banking ad, you're going to hear at the very end, in like the little legalese voice. Remember FDIC. That's just letting you know that if you bank with them and their bank falls apart or explodes or whatever, you'll still have your money. Credit unions have a similar agency. It wasn't made in the New Deal era, but it's around now. I think it's like the NCUA, National Credit Union, something like that. But credit unions have a similar organization that does basically the same thing. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, for those of you that know your Roman numerals, you already know, but for those of you that aren't sure about your Roman numerals, an M is 1,000, millennium, 1,000. C is 100, like a century. X's are 10, the I is a 1, and the V is a 5. So the MCM means 1,000 plus 100 before 1,000, so 900. So 1,000 plus 900 is 1,900. And then plus 10 plus 10 plus 10 is 30. And then plus 1 before 5 is 4. So 1934 is what that means. U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. And if you're like, I didn't follow any of that at all, good news. You don't need to know Roman numerals because we use Arabic numerals, which are way better. 1, 2, 3, the actual. Those things. Roman, Arabic numerals. Well, Hindu Arabic numerals. Sorry, history, math's pretty cool. But that's not what we're learning, so we're gonna move on. So the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, founded in 1934, and the whole reason for that is because of the stock market crash. Remember Black Tuesday, 1929, stock market crashes. It's not the only thing that caused the Great Depression, but it's a big, big, big deal in sort of kicking off the Great Depression. A lot of history books will put the Great Depression officially starting at the stock market crash. And so the U.S. government under Roosevelt was like, well, we can't just let the stock market do whatever they want. There needs to be rules. There needs to be regulations. There need to be laws. And there need to be punishment mechanisms for companies and stockbrokers and traders that break these rules. And the basic rules, the specific laws are super complicated and we're not going to get into it because that's an entire course in college if you're going to law school or if you're going to go to business school and learn about this stuff. So we don't have time for that. But the basic rules is that these companies that are offering these stocks, these bonds, the securities, part of the name, if you're a company that sells those and buys them, you have to be honest about what you're offering. You have to disclose what's in the stock, what's in the bond, what's in the mutual fund. And if you aren't honest about it, you can go to jail for a very long time. And stockbrokers, they have to treat their investors fairly and honestly. They have to be, the technical term for that is they need to be fiduciaries. They need to take good care of your money. They can't just steal it and run off with it, through various scams and illegal things. So if you've seen like The Wolf of Wall Street, you've seen the SEC at work. They were one of the primary villains. Jordan Belfort was the villain in Wolf of Wall Street. He was the protagonist, so he was the main character, but he was not the hero. The SEC were one of the agencies that he was very scared of because he was not being an honest person. And when we're talking about the SEC, we're not talking about the football conference in college football. If you're a college football fan, that's fine. We're not talking about that SEC. We're talking about the Securities and Exchange Commission. So it basically does the same thing now. It investigates, people breaking the law, companies and stockbrokers that are breaking the law. This is the field that my wife works in, and she's never had an issue with this because she's not that high up there, and she's very much someone that's going to follow the rules. But she's heard horror stories from people that have been in the business long enough that the SEC just shows up, and then that person disappears. Their computer gets taken, all their files get taken, that person just disappears. and they're in court for a very long time, and they might go to jail for a very long time. So again, if you saw The Wolf of Wall Street, you've seen what can happen. Your entire career can just disappear if you're not careful with the SEC. What they also do now is they actually educate the public on how to safely invest your money. The SEC's website has some good starting information if you're looking into investing. They're not going to tell you what to invest in, but they've got some good basic information on what the terminology means, like what the products are, and what the basic idea behind investing is. Like, they've got decent educational resources. So if you're interested in playing the stock market and investing things, the SEC's website's not a bad place to take a look. I mean, their advice is not the very best advice. Their advice is not something you should follow to the letter. You should follow the law, but their advice is just their advice, right? So it's not bad education. It's a pretty good little system they got. And if you're a small business and you're like, I want to offer some stocks, or I want to offer some investment opportunities for people, but I did not take an entire semester course in law school on how to not break the law with the SEC. You can actually call up the SEC. You can be like, hey, I'm starting a small business and I'm doing some stuff and I want to make sure I don't break the law. And they're going to be like, okay, cool, because they're not like the FBI where they're like, oh, we're going to investigate these criminals. The SEC, I mean, they'll investigate people that break the law on purpose, and they'll punish people that break the law on purpose. But if you're just trying to do the right thing and you call them up, they'll be able to give you advice. And they've got educational resources if you're going to start a small business, and if you're going to offer investment opportunities in your small business. So that way you don't accidentally break the law. All right. So that's the Security and Exchange Commission. Big deal for stockbrokers in the stock market because of the stock market crash, right? So all these things we can look at and see, like, here's a thing that happened during the Great Depression. Banks failed. So now we have the FDIC. The stock market crashed. Well, now we have the SEC to regulate the stock market. And the Social Security Administration comes about basically the same way. Remember, when we talked about the stock market crashing and the banks failing, that wiped out a ton of people's retirement, right? Like, they had invested in the stock market, they had put their money in banks so they could retire comfortably. Well, for a lot of Americans, that money is just gone. And for the Americans that are, 25, 30 years old, they're going to have time to rebuild that money so that they can retire. But if you're 65 years old, 70 years old, you're already retired, you can't go to work. Some people had to go to work the rest of their lives, but that's not realistic, especially when there was such high unemployment at the time. So 1935 Social Security Act is mainly to help the elderly, right? So FDR wanted these Americans to be able to retire with dignity. Now, we talked yesterday about how Huey Long didn't think this was enough. He wanted even more money to go to retired Americans. But Huey Long got assassinated in 1935. So the Social Security is what ended up happening. And Social Security still exists today. Now, this particular painting is I believe a Norman Rockwell. It's a series of 4 paintings based around FDR and the New Deal and the 4 freedoms of America. This particular one is the freedom from want. This is clearly a very nice Thanksgiving dinner. Grandma and Grandpa have the whole family over, and they are fixing a nice spread of food. So some of you may have been lucky enough to get a spread of food like this. I certainly was. Not inside. We had to gather outside because of the coronavirus. But there's a lot of people that don't get this, right? And Social Security was originally put together to make sure older Americans who had worked their whole lives could actually retire with a little bit of dignity, which is still basically what it's for. As you work, so for those of you that have already had a job and already have paychecks, you already know. You've seen this. But if you haven't had a job yet, and you're going to be getting one soon, understand you're going to get taxes pulled out of your paycheck, and one of those taxes you're going to get pulled out of every paycheck is your Social Security amount. So as you work, as you get a job, you pay into Social Security. I did for many years, and now as a teacher in the state of Texas, I do not, because I pay into Texas retirement. It's a different thing that's like Social Security. But if you work for basically any job, just about any job, you'll be paying into Social Security, and you pay into that your entire working life. And then when you retire, they kind of take a look at all the money you put into the system, and they give you back that money over, every month that you're retired. And you can check, you can make an account on their website, and you can track where you're at, and it'd be like, well, if you retired today, here's how much money you'd get per month. Now you have to wait to a certain age to retire. You can't just make a bunch of money in your 20s and then retire. You can, but you can't get Social Security at that point. Just a second. And another thing that they do is they publish the most popular baby names of the year every year. So you can check their website for that. That's not very important. The more important thing is you pay money into it, and they use that money to pay people who are retired. And you may have heard, Social Security is in danger and it's not going to exist when you retire. And I guess that's possible. But there's a few pretty simple math things they could do to make sure that it keeps going forever and ever and ever. And the biggest one is to tell Congress to stop stealing money from it. Because every time Congress, they pass a law and they're like, hey, we're going to build a new thing and it's going to cost a lot of money, but we don't want to raise taxes because that would be unpopular. How about we pull money out of the Social Security fund and put an IOU in there? So if we stop doing that and we modify the do a little bit more, taxes a tiny bit, really not much more. For most of you, wouldn't even notice it. It might be a few cents more off a paycheck. But we tax a little bit more on it, and we stop Congress from just yanking money out of it anytime they feel like. Social Security will be around basically forever. So, it might fail. It's entirely possible to fail, but mathematically, it's not a surefire thing. You can definitely save it with not a whole lot of effort. We'll see if Congress and the president and the courts can all work together to do it, though. So next up is the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, this is one of those ones that wasn't because of the stock market crash. It wasn't because of bank failures, but it was initially designed as a way to sort of bring down unemployment, but in a sort of crazy new experimental way. Instead of just okay, go work on some little projects. This is a from the ground up, build up an entirely new system of dams, hydroelectric dams, power plants, at the time coal powered. These days, they're trying to move away from coal powered plants, but basically take the entire Tennessee River Valley and modernize it from the ground up using federal money and federal planning. And honestly, it's a pretty darn good experimental result. Not perfect, obviously, but for the first big public works experiment of its kind in the United States, remarkably successful. So it was put together, as passed, in Congress in 1933. So again, in this first year of the New Deal. And they want to regulate the natural resources in the area. They want to conserve the natural resources. They want to use them intelligently. They want to plan ahead on them. They want to kind of think long term with the natural resources in this area. And they want to do flood control, which is what all those bars in the river are, trying to kind of help make sure things don't flood, and the dams are for. And it's to build all these big things. It's to protect the valley. It's to sort of long term use the resources of the valley. And now you get a ton of electricity, and you get a ton of jobs, and you get a ton of economic growth in the area, which helps with the unemployment rate, which helps get the wheels turning in the economy to sort of get us out of the Great Depression. And the TVA is still around. It manages all those power plants. Now, its big thing these days is to take all of the coal power plants that they had built back in the 1930s and switch them over where possible to hydroelectric power plants. All those dams in the river that you can see can definitely be hydroelectric plants. And the ones that can't be made hydroelectric, trying to turn those into nuclear power plants. So that's kind of what they're doing these days. And another thing that we talked about, a big problem that we talked about with people, losing the money in the stock market, the banks failing, jobs failing, and unemployment being a big problem. Something that a lot of you pointed out in the various, discussions and quizzes and assignments and stuff that we've had, is that you lose your job, you lose your house, or your apartment, or wherever you're living, right? Especially back then. These days there's some programs, there's some ways you can, maybe try and hold on to it for a little bit before you end up, having to move or get kicked out or evicted or whatever. But a lot of people lost houses, lost their homes. And in 1934, so kind of entering into the second year of the Roosevelt presidency, you have the Federal Housing Administration put together. And the whole point of this is to get people back into houses. If people buy houses, well, that adds good economic growth to the area. If you have to build a new house, that's an architect and construction workers and plumbers and electricians and all these people that need to build the house. That's jobs. And even if it's a pre-built house, there might need to be some work done on it. And if you're buying a house in the area, then you're going to get a job in the area and you're going to be spending money in the area. So even buying a pre-built house, that's still, bringing economic, activity back to that area. And so the FHA offers very low-cost loans to buy houses, even to remodel your house. And if you've ever worked on, you probably haven't done a lot of construction work, but some of you may have helped around the house or helped on some construction jobs already. And you may have heard the term is this up to code? Is this according to code? Will this pass code? And the FHA is the one that kind of helped develop some of these housing codes, and they're not the ones that were responsible or so on, but they kind of help put them together. And also, if you're going to get an FHA loan, the house has to be up to code. It has to be safe, right? The electricity has to be done properly, so it doesn't start a fire. The foundation has to have been done properly, so it doesn't crack and destroy the house. Sorry, the home has to be safe. So the FHA is a very, very useful group. It's still around. It's been moved under the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and as you can see in the ad originally, a lot of this was pointed toward World War I veterans, right? You're a veteran of World War I, you're homeless, you don't have a lot of money, you're unemployed. Here's a way to try and get you back into a house. Now, it wasn't just for veterans, but it's very much pointed at veterans. These days, you can get a very low-cost home loan, mortgage, and mortgage insurance, actually, if you're a first-time home buyer. So if you haven't bought a house before and you're looking to buy a house, now if you live in a house when you were a kid, you didn't buy that house. So when you end up growing up, probably when you move out of your house, you'll end up in a dorm or an apartment for a while, or renting a house maybe. Obviously, nothing wrong with that. But eventually, if you end up getting to a point where you're going to buy a house, take a look at your FHA options. If it's your first house, it might not be the best mortgage deal. It might not be the lowest loan you can get, depending on your credit score and the area and the lenders you're looking at. But take a look at the FHA options. It's probably going to be one of the more competitive ones. And the other big thing that it does these days, other than back then it helped make sure houses are up to code, and it's still a big thing. You have to make sure if you buy a house with an FHA loan, that's still part of it. But the other big thing it does these days is it enforces the Fair Housing Act, which was not passed in 1934. That was passed much later during the Civil Rights era, which we'll get to. But the Fair Housing Act says that it is illegal to discriminate when you're buying, selling, or renting property based on ethnicity, gender, there's a few different things, a few different categories that are protected under the Fair Housing Act. But this basically was like, you can't not sell to someone because they're black or Hispanic or Asian or not white or whatever. And FHA is the one that tracks that and enforces that. So not all of these things that we talked about today happen in those first 100 days, but the first 100 days are a big, big, big deal in FDR's presidency and in every presidency since, because FDR made such a big deal out of his first 100 days. So here's an excerpt from David Kennedy's Freedom from Fear. It's a much longer book than just this passage, but this is a good little passage in it. I'll just go over it and then we'll summarize it. By any standard, the achievements of the first 100 days were impressive. The New Deal had decisively halted the banking panic. It had invented wholly new institutions to restructure vast tracts of the nation's economy, from banking to agriculture to industry to labor relations. It had authorized the biggest public works program in American history. It had earmarked billions of dollars for federal relief to the unemployed. It had designated the Great Tennessee Watershed as the site of an unprecedented experiment in comprehensive, planned regional development. No less important, the spirit of the country, so discouraged by 4 years of economic devastation, had been infused with Roosevelt's own contagious optimism and hope. But for all of the excitement about the 100 days, the Depression still hung darkly over the land. The precise battle plan of the New Deal's attack on it remained difficult to define. Little coherent pattern could be detected in the unlikely mixture of policies that had been adopted. They ranged from orthodox budget cutting to expansive spending for relief in public works, from tough controls on Wall Street to government-supervised cartelization, from deliberate crop destruction to thoughtful conservation, from mortgage protection for the middle class to union protection for labor. Some of these measures aimed at economic recovery, but at least as many were meant to provide only palliative relief, or to enact reforms long-standing on someone's agenda, but only obliquely related to combating the Depression. About the only defensible statement that could be made about them in the aggregate was that they accurately reflected Roosevelt's penchant for action, his inclination to experiment, and his receptivity to all kinds of innovation. Now that's a whole lot, but basically what it breaks down to is this: your pros and cons of the first 100 days. The pros are great. Like, I'm not going to try and bad talk any of these pros. Stops the banking panic. Doesn't completely fix the banks, but it stops the panic, which is the first step. You end up with these new programs to try and help fix the economy, programs to help farmers, programs to help unions and their workers, programs to help factories and their owners, programs to help the unemployed, which is kind of the number one problem in the Great Depression. If you can fix unemployment, you can probably fix the Great Depression. You have this massive public works spending. We talked about the Hoover Dam the other day. We talked about the Tennessee River Valley today. And it just brought a sense of hope back, right? Like, there's something coming, right? Like right now, November 30th, there's a lot of good news about some of these coronavirus vaccines coming out. There's a few companies, there's a lot of promising stuff about it. It's not here yet, obviously, so still be careful. But, it's kind of nice to have that hope, right? Even though it's not here yet. Kind of like that for those first 100 days. Now, of course, the cons, the author mentioned in the passage, there wasn't really a unified plan. And some of the programs seemed to work against some of the other programs, kind of like the right hand didn't quite know what the left hand was doing. And a lot of the programs weren't there to solve the big structural problems of the Great Depression and really solve the Great Depression. They're just some temporary short-term relief, which isn't a terrible thing, but you can't just short-term relief, right? Like if you get a cut on your arm, yes, you need to apply pressure, but eventually you're going to need to like clean it off, bandage it up, actually stop the bleeding, and start healing. And even everything that he did, even all the things Congress did and FDR did and groups did during this time period, didn't fix it. The Great Depression, even historians and economists that are a big fan of FDR and his programs in the New Deal, very few of them would make the claim the New Deal got us out of the Great Depression by itself. A big, big, big part of this is going to be World War II and the economic effects of World War II on America, which we'll get to next semester. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at. So appreciate it. Tomorrow we're going to talk about court packing, then and now. And then Thursday we'll have the quiz. And then Friday we'll talk about Huey Long. So see you then. Is that how I'm ending this one? I guess it is.